But thank you all so much for coming on a Friday morning or Friday evening, wherever you're joining us from. We're really excited to have this great lineup of speakers today to talk about this recent paper published in the Lancet Planetary Health on women's empowerment, production choices, and crop diversity across 4 countries. I perhaps should start by introducing myself. My name is Lindsay Jacks. I'm a professor of global health and nutrition at the Global Academy of Agriculture and Food Systems here at the University of Edinburgh. And I'm speaking today as part of, as an academic advisor to Anuvaad Solutions, which is an organization based in Delhi in India that has been conceptualized to kind of bridge the gap between knowledge and research and scientific evidence and policy action in order to promote India's health and nutrition agenda. And one of the areas of our work is very much around disseminating new research findings, such as the findings that we're going to talk about today, and discussing sort of the implications in terms of programs, schemes, government schemes, and policies around the world. So thank you all so much again for joining. We're going to start out with 2 presentations, one to kind of set the scene for why crop diversification is an important outcome to be looking at, and then another that will be followed by a presentation presenting the key findings of the paper, and then we'll jump right into a panel discussion. We do have some questions pre-prepared for the panel, but feel free to also put any questions that you might have in the chat box, and we'll also get to audience questions during the panel. All right, so we'll go ahead and kick it off. So our first speaker today, we're so lucky to have Professor Rachel Besner-Kerr, who's a professor of global development at Cornell University in Ithaca, New York. Rachel does long-term research in Malawi and Tanzania, and today one of the studies that's included in this paper is a study that she was PI of called SNAP-TZ in Tanzania. And these studies use community-based participatory research methods to test the impacts of agroecological approaches on livelihoods, nutrition, and soil management for rural communities. Rachel was also the lead author for the latest lead author on the latest IPCC report. So we're really honored to have her here and also to have the SNAP-TZ study as part of this multi-country analysis. So thank you again, and over to you, Rachel.
Thank you so much, and I'm really honored to be here, and thanks to everyone who's been willing to join us for this webinar. And I am going to, as Dr. Jacks pointed out, I'm going to give an overview of why crop diversity matters. And first, I want to just briefly mention what is crop.
Rachel, I'm just going to pause you. Sorry, so sorry. We're seeing your presenter view instead of your main slide. I think
goody. Oh,
you could probably just swap display. Yeah. Yep, you're good. You're good. Thank you.
So what is crop diversity? We're talking about different species of crops as well as different varieties of crops. So both genetic and species variation. And crop diversity is a subset of agricultural biodiversity more broadly. And the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services considers agricultural biodiversity to be really under threat. And it's estimated, the Food and Agriculture Organization estimates that 3/4 of the world's genetic diversity, genetic diversity has been lost in the last century. And although humans have consumed over 6,000 different plant species for food, only about 9 species account for 2/3 of crop production, and half of our diets globally are made up of only 3 crops. And so we rely on a very narrow range of crops for our food. And this is important because crop diversity from a farming perspective provides an important source of livelihoods, not only in terms of food, but also other things that crops can be used for. So they provide a source of fodder, They can be sold and used as a source of income. They can provide shade if you're using fruit trees, for example. So this multi-purpose aspect bolsters resilience for farmers and also reduces the risk of crop loss from a given crop. And so there's strong evidence in the literature that having greater crop diversity provides greater income stability for farmers. And it can increase farm income, but this is dependent on the market context. It depends on the agroecosystem context and policies in place that may support or may undermine crop diversity. And there is also strong evidence that greater crop diversity is linked to greater employment opportunities. Alongside this economic benefit, crop diversity also helps farmers adapt to climate change. And the review that we undertook as part of the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change really found strong evidence around this point. Not only does crop diversity help farmers in terms of reducing economic risk, but it also supports key ecosystem processes. So this is everything from pollination to supporting soil health, adding microbial activity and organic matter to the soil, supporting nutrient cycling and water quality. And all of these things ensure that there is increased resilience to things such as drought and pest outbreaks that are on the rise with climate change impacts. And there was an important study done in 2020 that was a review that included 98 meta-reviews and over 6,000 individual peer-reviewed studies that found that agricultural diversification supported both these ecosystem services as well as yield. And so it doesn't have this negative effect on yield that is often that is one of the assumptions that is counter to supporting crop diversity. So this is true in the short term, but also in the long term. There have been quite a few studies looking at modeling different climate change scenarios, finding that crop diversity really helps with yield stability, helps reduce yield losses, and supports farm income long term. So one study that looked for example, in Canada, compared diversified rotations to monoculture corn and found both positive yield impacts, yield stability, and increased soil organic carbon under 2 different climate scenarios by 2100. Of course, this varies a lot. The impact varies depending on the cropping system, the policy environment, the market environment, and the agroecosystem. So there's more research that can be done on this, but the evidence is strong that crop diversity has this important resilience benefit. In terms of nutrition, we know that having greater diversity in our cropping systems allows for greater diversity of diets inherently. And on a global scale, small and mid-sized farms are those that are producing the majority of things like fruits, vegetables, tubers, and pulses in diverse landscapes. And there's a number of reviews that have looked at whether crop diversity is positively linked directly to dietary diversity. And it shows that there is this positive link, but it's context specific and particularly true for farm households in low-income countries. And there's also evidence that having greater crop diversity on farm increases the diversity of regional and local markets. So for households who are not farming but are purchasing locally and regionally, there is more available for them to have diverse diets. So the link between crop diversity and dietary diversity is stronger for subsistence households and for sub-Saharan Africa in the literature. I'll just give briefly 2 examples from my own research in Malawi and Tanzania, and one of those examples is the one that was included in this Lancet study that we're talking about today. In both of these studies, they were using, the intervention was broader than crop diversity. It was focused on agroecology and addressing social inequities, but crop diversity was one of the practices that farmers experimented with. And in both studies, we had a pre-post design, so before and after, and compared households participating in the intervention to households in control households. And in both cases, we saw in a period of 3 years a significant increase in crop diversity. And this varied depending on the site, but included things like millets, and included a number of legumes and pumpkins. And in both of these studies, there was a significant relationship when controlling for other factors that affect food security between crop diversity, improvements in food security, household food security, and improvements in dietary diversity. In Malawi, we found improvements in and Tanzania in women's dietary diversity for those in the intervention compared to those not. In Malawi, a household was 32% less likely to be severely food insecure per additional food crop grown. So that additional food crop really made a difference in terms of food security. And it also improved the chances of children having a minimum acceptable diet in terms of diversity in Tanzania. And the pathways by which people improved their food security wasn't just that they were consuming greater number of crops. They might reduce their amount of time weeding because of intercropping. They improved their soil health and had to spend less money on fertilizer, and they took that money and invested it in animals or invested it in small vegetable gardens. They increased their income and they were able to purchase more because they had greater crops to sell. They held back and were able to sell, get a better price for that crop. And so this allowed them to no longer have to work in other people's farms during this hungry season, which gave them more time to invest in their own crops. So there were a number of different pathways by which this link between crop diversity and improved food security and dietary diversity happened. So overall, just to wrap it up, there's strong evidence that crop diversity is under threat globally, and it has important health and nutrition implications for people. It provides income stability for farmers and reduces their risk of crop failure, and it builds resilience overall in the farming system by supporting these key ecosystem processes such as pollination, soil health, and water quality. And there's evidence of positive links between improved crop diversity, increased crop diversity, and improved dietary diversity, particularly for smallholder farming households. And this is context specific. So with that, I would like to pass back the baton once I stop sharing somehow.
Thank you very much. Excellent. So we're just going to keep going, and as I mentioned before, I'm sure there will be questions following the presentation, so feel free to pop them in the chat as they come up, and we'll address them when we get to the panel. So we're going to just move on to our next speaker, who's Kayla Connors. Kayla is a PhD candidate here at the University of Edinburgh and was the first author on this Lancet paper. Her PhD thesis will focus on something a bit different, looking at reducing red and processed meat consumption in Mexico for environmental and health benefits. But she's really broadly interested in studying the intersection between sustainability, food system transitions, and health with a focus on equity. So this particular analysis and paper was a really good fit for her broader research interests. So thanks, Kayla, for taking the time to kind of give us an overview of what you did for this analysis and some of the key findings. So over to you, and we can see your screen very well.
Okay, great. Hi, everyone. I'm Kayla, as Lindsay just mentioned, and I'm going to go over the paper that was just published in Lancet Planetary Health and how we went about analyzing the association between women's empowerment and crop diversity. And here I have listed all of my co-authors, which I'd like to acknowledge from the start of this presentation. So why study women's empowerment and crop diversity? We were interested in investigating the important role that women have in smallholder agriculture, given that smallholder farms are 80% of the world's farms. And so while women contribute to global agricultural production, they traditionally have less agency and control over decisions such as agricultural decisions, less access to and control over resources such as land ownership, and fewer opportunities for leadership, training, and community participation. And for these reasons, promoting women's rights remains a high global priority as well as investigating their unique potential contributions to agriculture and planetary health. And so in terms of linking women's empowerment to crop diversity, there's evidence that women compared to men, although this can depend on context, but women compared to men are typically more responsible for nourishing their families, and that as a result of these differing priorities, they tend to focus on food cropping. And so we were interested if, based on this previous evidence, this would influence women to choose to cultivate more diverse and nutritious crops when granted the agency and resource to do so, in other words, when empowered. And so as Rachel just mentioned, crop diversity can produce multiple benefits to planetary health, climate change resilience, and potentially diet quality, particularly among subsistence agricultural households. And so in all, while women's empowerment and women's rights are high priorities on the human rights and sustainable development agendas, it may also reinforce other critical and timely agendas, such as the provision of a healthy diet from a healthy planet. And so our research question was, is women's empowerment associated with farm-level crop diversity among low-income agricultural households? And we hypothesized that, in fact, greater women's empowerment would be associated with increased farm-level crop diversity. So we were interested in studies which had measured women's empowerment, had information on cropping patterns at the farm level, and in geographical representation. And so we identified 4 studies and reached out to study authors to see if they would be willing to share their data with us. And we used baseline data from all 4 clustered randomized controlled trials, of which enrolled women of reproductive age with young children. All were of low-income households and resided in rural or peri-urban settings. So as I mentioned, we wanted to use a standardized measurement of women's empowerment, so we would be able to compare across settings. And we used the Women's Empowerment in Agriculture Index, since it was specifically designed to measure women's empowerment in agricultural production. And we created indicators based on counts of achievement in each area, as I've defined here. And this really allowed us to parse out what dimensions of women's empowerment specifically were associated with crop diversity. And so, for example, if you can see on the left here, input into productive decision was measured as the number of areas in which a woman made decisions, and these ranged from food production to livestock raising and household expenditures. Ownership of assets was the count of assets that a woman owned solely or jointly, and these included anything from land ownership to farm equipment and consumer durables. Access to and decisions about credit was the count of credit sources a woman had access to or decisions on, and these could be a formal lender, NGOs, or even friends and relatives. Group membership was the number of groups that a woman actively participated in, and a few examples were women's self-help groups or farmer associations. And then lastly, workload was the number of productive work hours a woman reported working in a day, and these productive work was considered something such as farming, cooking, or cleaning, etc. So as for crop diversity, as I mentioned, we had information on farm level cropping patterns, and these were all collected during the primary growing season, which allowed us to account for seasonality. And we defined crop diversity using 3 indicators. The first was food crop count, which was a count of food crops that were cultivated. This excluded non-food cash crops such as cotton or tobacco. The second indicator was food group count, which reflected a count of different food groups. And what we tried to achieve with this measure was to measure access to a diverse diet, which is important for diet quality. And then lastly, we had a binary cultivation of nutrient-dense crops, where if the household cultivated any of these food groups, they received a score of yes, and if they had not, they received a score of no. So in terms of the analysis, we assessed the association with all 5 indicators of women's empowerment with all 3 indicators of crop diversity using multivariable linear regression for each country. So with these country-specific associations, we then pooled them in a meta-analysis to see if these associations held across contexts. And in terms of what we found regarding the distribution of crop diversity, we can see that a majority of households across all 4 settings cultivated grains, roots, and tubers. And in terms of crop diversity by all 3 measures, Malawi had the highest crop diversity, and we can see that here as it's represented by the green bars, and India had the lowest crop diversity by all 3 measures, as is illustrated here by the red bars. So the next few slides, I'm going to present the main results from our analyses, but first I'll show you how it's organized. On the left, we have the indicators for women's empowerment, and then above we have the columns for the country-specific associations. And then on the right, we have all countries, which represents the pooled analyses across all 4 country-specific associations. And then an up arrow represents a positive association. A down arrow represents a negative association. If it's filled in gray, no association was observed. And if it's N8, it means that information was not available for that country. And so you can see here our outcome of interest was food crop diversity. And in terms of input into productive decisions, we did observe an association with food crop diversity in Burkina Faso, India, and Malawi. However, no association was observed in Tanzania. And when we pulled these analyses, we did observe an overall association. For ownership of assets, there was an overall association. However, this seems to have been driven by the positive association in India. For access to credit, we only found an association with food crop diversity in India. And when we pulled these results, there was no association. For decisions about credit, interestingly, we found a positive association in Burkina Faso with food crop diversity, but a negative association in India, and no overall association. With group membership, there was a positive association in Burkina Faso and Tanzania, and in the pooled meta-analysis. And you'll note here that for workload, we observed no association in the country-specific or pooled associations. Moving on to food group diversity, we found pretty consistent results. Between decision-making and food group diversity, there were positive associations in Burkina Faso, India, and Malawi, and also when we pulled these results. For ownership of assets, again, there's a positive association in India and an overall association. For access to credit, there was a negative association with food group diversity in Tanzania. And then for group membership, again, we found positive association with food group diversity in Burkina Faso, Malawi, and Tanzania, and overall. And again, you'll note no association with workload and food group diversity. And then lastly, for nutrient-dense crop cultivation, we found a positive association between decision-making and cultivation of nutrient-dense crops in all 4 countries, as well as the overall pooled association. Similarly, between ownership of assets and nutrient-dense crop cultivation, we observed a positive association in India and at the pooled level. And we also found a positive association between access to credit and nutrient-dense crop cultivation in Burkina Faso and India. However, this association was negative in Tanzania. And again, you'll notice no associations were observed for workload. So in all with this, what we took away from these findings was that decision-making, meaning input into productive decisions, asset ownership and group membership may be important for farm-level crop diversity among low-income agricultural households. It's important to note that these are all modifiable, meaning that they can be specifically targeted by interventions hoping to promote both women's empowerment and potentially benefit crop diversity. And we also found that context matters. We observed country-specific associations that were not observed when the results were pooled across all 4 settings. We also observed associations going in opposite direction depending on the context. And then in terms of limitations, we lacked information on market access, which is important for diet quality and in some cases agricultural diversification. And so future studies should aim to examine the role of market access in the association between women's empowerment and crop diversity. And then lastly, this was a cross-sectional analysis, so we cannot make any causal statements about the findings that we have observed. And I'd like to end here with acknowledgements. Thank you to the research teams and investigators that provided us with this data to make this secondary analysis possible. Thank you to the original data collection teams and study respondents, and to the WEA team for providing technical insight as to the harmonization of these indicators across settings. And thank you to Anuvaad for hosting this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, Kayla. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions, and a couple are already starting to pop up in the chat, which is great because we're just about to move into our panel. Our panel will include of course, the 2 people who just spoke, but we have 2 other people joining the panel. Professor Sunitha Kadiyala, who's the professor of global nutrition at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. Many of you may know her as she's the PI of Amana, which is aiming to stimulate the development and application of scientifically sound methods and metrics at the nexus of agriculture, health, and nutrition, which is very relevant for the talk today. As I mentioned in the chat, she's also the PI of the Upavan trial, which is a study from India that was included in this paper, and we've shared the link to that original study as well in the chat. And Sunitha's current work includes the design and evaluation of complex nutrition-sensitive agriculture programs, as well as the development of methods and metrics to study that nexus between agriculture, health, and nutrition. So really happy to have you joining our panel today. We also have Dr. Lily Blisnashka, who's a research fellow in nutrition, diets, and health at the International Food Policy Research Institute, IFPRI, based in DC. And Lily's research focuses on assessing the effectiveness of multi-input, also nutrition-sensitive and nutrition-specific interventions, and the mechanisms and pathways by which they work to improve maternal and child health, as well as child development globally. So delighted to have all of our panelists here today to talk about this analysis, but really hoping that we can take it beyond the results that were presented in the paper and talk a little bit more about the application of these findings. So I might just go ahead and kick it off with one question, which actually links to that last slide that you just showed, Kayla, around market access. So just posing a question to the group here, because these forward market linkages are really a hot topic in nutrition-sensitive agriculture interventions now, particularly in the Indian context, but really globally. And so I just, wanted to ask the group how you think market access might have influenced the findings, particularly, any variability that we saw across findings between countries. So over to the panel for that first question, market access. And feel free to maybe just unmute yourself if that's all right, but also to raise a hand. But I think with just 4 panelists, it's totally fine to just unmute.
Maybe I'll kick it off. In the context of Tanzania, which is one of the 4 studies that the one that I was involved with, the market access alone, I don't think played a major factor because, because the markets are quite poor, so they're low. There's low availability of foods in those markets. So number one, so unless you're increasing crop diversity, because it's mostly local and regional markets that people are purchasing their foods from. And number two, because of low income, even if those foods are available, they aren't necessarily accessible to the food insecure households that we were targeting, that we were working with. That would be true with context. So unless you're changing both the income and the availability of foods at those local markets, market access is not a major factor in improving dietary diversity.
Yep. Sunitha, do you want to come in on that with respect to India? Because I think that Upavan also had some similar context.
Yeah, thanks for that. In great presentation overall. Thanks for that. And so in the Upavan context, there's some questions around about India. This study was conducted in Kionja district in Odisha in India, which is in the eastern part of India. And what we find is somewhat similar to what Rachel said, that the households, even when they have land, as you have seen in the results for overall, crop diversity is low in India compared to other contexts because there is a huge policy bias towards staples, especially rice and wheat in India. Much of the food produced by the subsistence households, what we find in our baseline data, is actually consumed by the households. It's so little that actually it was not, the sale of it was negligible by the households. However, overall, because the land is so small, and it's often the case that the food that they're able to produce on their land is insufficient to meet all household requirements. So yes, they do depend on markets to buy the food that they require for the whole family throughout all the seasons. So while we haven't looked at, does local market stimulate crop diversity? I mean, that's not the question we went to address. But what I can say, actually, I'm just coming from Bihar in India, and we conducted some formative work on the role of markets in nutrition security in Bihar. And what we are finding is households buy at least 80% of nutrient-dense foods from the markets. Even if they have small plots of land around that. So, and as Rachel was saying, but it's also reflecting other global literature as well.
Yeah.
I just wanted to say that affordability is a huge issue. So they depend on the markets, but they are still not able to consume the quantities that they require because they are expensive. Even to go to the markets, especially now is the rainy season, flooding, all kinds of things happen, as you know, and so access and availability, affordability especially, tends to be still a huge issue. Yeah.
Lily and Kayla, anything to add before I jump to one of my questions, which I'm going to actually merge with a question that's been asked in the chat here, because I think we're on the same brainwave for this particular question around, of the 4 studies included, what sort of gender-specific interventions were part of the projects? For example, Upavan or SNAP-TZ or the IFPRI studies in Malawi and Burkina, like what were the types of gender-specific activities, if any, across the different projects? And I might just tag my question onto that, if I might, which is what sort of activities could be conducted by those interested in integrating gender-specific work into their nutrition-sensitive agriculture interventions. So maybe, Lily, we could start with you, if that's all right, if you have any information about the 2 other studies that we've not yet discussed.
Sure. So the two IFPRI studies, which were led by IFPRI PIs in Burkina Faso and Malawi, were both kind of nutrition sensitive, gender sensitive interventions. In Burkina Faso, the intervention was targeted around focused on poultry ownership and land ownership and kind of shifting gender norms around women engaged in small livestock production, right? The poultry. Whereas in Malawi, the program was structured around caregivers and how they can better take care of their children, kind of standard behavior change. Well, I shouldn't say standard, but behavior change communication coupled with school level gardens and really kind of involving the caregivers more into both kind of improving cropping as well as child care. I, off the top of my head, unfortunately, do not remember the intervention impacts with respect to whether these interventions improved empowerment. So I can't really comment on their effectiveness. In our case, as Kayla highlighted in her presentation, we did use baseline data. So that is pre any of the interventions. But it is a very important question of understanding which interventions improve both women's empowerment and crop diversity, and whether there is an actual kind of link between improved women's empowerment and crop diversity, and not just these associations that we're looking at, which are very important. And I think one important aspect in thinking about interventions is really focusing on ones that are more around task shifting and not increasing women's burden and adding to their activities and improving women's empowerment in a more kind of holistic, thoughtful manner, and thinking about gender norms as well as societal and community norms.
Yeah, although it is interesting that workload, we were all surprised really by the crop diversity and workload lack of association there, which actually is kind of promising because people do sometimes criticize the workload aspect, but that association wasn't here in the study, in any of the countries. Yeah. Maybe over to you, Rachel, for any inputs on the SNAP-TZ, any gender-specific activities that were done in Tanzania and the agroecological intervention there.
Sure. So with the SNAP-TZ initiative, it was gender was one of the core aspects addressing gender inequity. So there was a field trip of the kind of peer mentors to Malawi to learn what we had done there. And then we had 2 weeks of training that integrated agroecology with discussion of gender equity questions and with nutrition. And following that, so the peer mentors were men and women from each of the villages that we were working in who got this intensive training. And then they worked with the farmers in their village who were doing agroecological experiments. And they met monthly to talk about progress. And in those monthly meetings, the peer mentors would do additional discussions around gender issues of their choice, because it was a participatory model. And so the focus around gender was around agricultural decision making, around workload, division of workload, particularly greater sharing of household work, things like childcare and cooking. And I would say those were those were the two areas that the peer mentors chose to focus on. We also in the training had discussions of things like domestic violence and other aspects of gender, and we measured women's empowerment at the baseline and over time, and we did find a significant improvement in women's empowerment with those who were participating in the intervention compared to the control households. A lot of that improvement came from greater participation in group membership. We did find a significant improvement in women's workload, but it was very small. And I think we also found a small improvement in women's involvement in decision making, but that was from, I think, no involvement overall to some involvement. So it was modest improvements in women's empowerment overall, but we did find improvement. And we also measured women's mental health baseline and end line, and found a significant improvement in women's mental health. And we looked at the impact, we teased out what it was related to and found that it was significantly linked to both improvements in food security and improvements in women's empowerment. So that was a kind of exciting feature of our study.
Yeah. Very unique to have those outcome measures and be able to demonstrate those associations. Sunitha, did you want to comment at all about the Upavan and any gender-specific activities before I jump into my next query?
Yeah, it was all gender-specific in that sense. It was delivered through women's groups, self-help groups, as you call them in India, and also participatory learning and action groups, women's groups, as well in one of the arms. So it was the delivery platform itself was the women's groups for us, and our focus was on how can we harness the collective, power of the collective, although we haven't, I mean, I'm using those words, but in terms of this group approach to improve decisions around what is grown in any given season based on a seasonal calendar, but also how to improve production, especially when there are different constraints. So can you grow green leafy vegetables, how to grow green leafy vegetables, for example, using some kind, wastewater, how do you use that? Or how can you make pot manure at homes and things like that using participatory videos and as well as discussions in PLA groups, so that they're able to improve the production of what is contextually relevant and what is demand driven from their end. And so we didn't try and introduce new crops or something that is, out there and, try to make them grow something that they have not heard or there is a demand for or anything like that. So it's very much focused on that, and of course improving the maternal and child feeding practices and so on, like in the usual, as Lily said, gamut of things we do in the maternal child health context. So that's what we had done, and we focus very much on. Initially, we focused on maybe a knowledge, creating a knowledge base of certain things, but gradually moved on in our theory of change, but also using behavior change theory to move up in terms of problem solving and capability building. And sadly, the trial had to stop then. So, yeah.
Thank you. So one of the things I'm hoping to bring up next relates to, and I think people in the audience will also be interested in this, is kind of the harmonization of something as complex as women's empowerment. Because in order to use this as a metric for evaluations or even thinking about potential indicators for future sustainable development goals or other, global targets, these metrics have to be developed and harmonized. But women's empowerment, unlike diet diversity, perhaps, is just so much more complicated and multifaceted and also context specific. So I might pitch this one first to you, Kayla, actually, because you had the firsthand experience of trying to harmonize data that had been collected and for very different contexts. What were some of the challenges that you faced and others might face when they go to do this in their own data moving forward using WEA or other women's empowerment metrics like WENI?
Thanks, Lindsay. Yeah, I think the first point that I think is interesting is that just empowerment in general, the interpretation of it can differ by context due to gender and patriarchal norms as well as culture. And so even if you're asking the same question, the interpretation of that question may differ. And so you may be capturing different kinds of information according to the participants' understanding. And then lastly is, in using a standardized measure, it allows for less flexibility on the part of those running the study to adapt it to local context, because it's a trade-off between comparability and capturing the information that you want local, like specific for your study.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Any other thoughts or comments on this from other panelists? And I'm actually going to take a peek because a couple more questions have come in as well.
Well, I mean, yeah, the thing is that there is a trade-off and there is a tension, right? I mean, these dimensions are complex for a reason. I think we are trying to measure something about women's empowerment, but it's such a latent construct that measuring that itself is quite complicated. That said, most of the time we are breaking that down to indicators or within that, right? Within the domains of that. So I don't know how we can ever resolve that tension. Dietary diversity too, I feel like the time has come where we got some important and useful information, but I think we have to really go back to understanding nutrient adequacy than have you eaten this or that, because again, coming from Bihar recently, when you ask women, because their knowledge base is high because of all the work Jivika had been doing very well on nutrition BCC, that they know what to eat. So they say, yes, we eat spinach. But then if you just go and ask, like, how did you cook? How did you do that? They say, oh, I threw like a bunch of, handful of things, a bunch of spinach or palak or whatever into a dal for the whole household, right? So from a check mark point of view, or even 15 grams, 25 grams point of view, fine. But there's huge nutrient adequacy issues at this point. So I feel like, I think we understood something and it has been a super helpful tool. But I do think we have to go back to the old way of understanding nutrient adequacy as well moving forward. I think this trip has really made me realize the importance of it. And thankfully, Olo tells me he developed a fabulous AI-related something in terms of measuring diets easily. So I'm hoping to learn more and try and attempt that. Thanks.
Thanks. Yes, definitely. Oh yeah, go ahead, Rachel, please.
I like the AI because I was going the opposite direction, Sunita, in terms of understanding women's empowerment. I think while these metrics are useful for comparison, I think to really understand what's happening in the context, you have to do qualitative research to really tease out those relationships. So yes, of course, it's useful to have these comparisons, but then to really understand what's happening, you need to do in-depth qualitative research.
Can I add to that? I cannot agree more. In fact, all our process evaluation led by Audrey Prost from UCL was very qualitative, right? Other than the indicators of coverage and so on, trying to understand the mechanisms was very much qualitative. And what do we find in our thing is that we ask, these women come and, there are, we are doing all these activities with them, and yet they need to go back to their homes and relay this and negotiate at home and so on and so forth. So what we find is that when the household is sort of an amenable household where there are relationships are less patriarchal and there is less negotiation needed, she's able to, maybe she's already empowered to have these, our interventions stick a bit. But when it is not so, you can also maybe say this is not, that maybe she's not as empowered yet, or, then we are asking in a way saying, go and negotiate how to grow this in with your husband or father-in-law or mother-in-law. So I think we still need to bridge that gap. And that's what we found through qualitative interviews and qualitative work, which we would have never found had we just stopped with collecting these indicators. So yeah, super important. Thanks for bringing that up.
That actually really brings us to a question that's come in from the chat around, what is the gap? Is it in terms of trying to bridge women's empowerment, diverse crop utilization, and sustainable food systems with the example of Malawi given, is it a gap of understanding or knowledge? Is it an implementation gap? Do we need policies? Like what's kind of the immediate next step or ask in terms of, you know, researchers, but also people involved in implementation? Any thoughts on that?
I can start and building off a little bit on the discussion about how qualitative work is really important and using standardized metrics. I think many issues are around implementation, how to implement well over time outside of a specific project or evaluation, and how to scale that to the larger district or, you know, the whole country. And looking at these kind of, is the intervention effective? It could be effective at small scale, but we have to learn how to scale it up and improve effectiveness and maintain effectiveness over time, right? And at a bigger scale. And some of that really relates to using qualitative methods and really understanding how the interventions work and are they suitable for the context. Because again, WEA is great as a standardized metrics, but it doesn't tell us much about women's empowerment in a specific context, and not understanding that could lead to, you know, implementing an intervention that's not entirely suitable, right? So I can't emphasize enough, you know, the importance of formative research and not just translating interventions that worked in one part of India, even to another part of India, let alone a different country. And to specifically for Malawi, because we do have a follow-on project of the original study, I think there it's particularly like kind of figuring out how to support the system and strengthen the system and the implementation. I think the kind of the desire is there, the policies are there, but it's really a matter of kind of taking it to scale and, you know, building the sustainability for the government to be able to implement these activities across the country.
Maybe I could just add on that, Lily. Thank you. In terms of Malawi, because I do most of my research in Malawi, I've actually been involved in doing an assessment with some Malawian colleagues on Malawian policies and how many of them have a focus on agroecological approaches, including crop diversity. And part of it is the policy context, because while there is promotion in policies of dietary diversity and women's empowerment in Malawi in particular, there's also heavy emphasis on maize production. So even though we're saying people should be eating greater diversity of foods, most of the Ministry of Agriculture funding is going towards ramping up maize production. And this isn't true only for Malawi, this is true for many countries, that the emphasis in terms of agricultural policy is still on a few crops. And that includes subsidies, that includes policies, that includes extension. And so while on the one hand, the nutrition wing of policy is saying we should be eating a greater diversity of foods, the agricultural wing is often just focused on a few staple crops. So I think that is a bit of a gap alongside some of these other challenges in implementation.
Thanks, Rachel. Yes, I was very much focusing on like kind of the nutrition, gender, health side, which is very strong in Malawi, but you know, policy convergence is important everywhere, and there is still that gap between some agricultural policies and nutrition policies.
May I just, in terms of the gap, is also how we design the interventions, right? So there's this really nice paper by Audrey Prost again and Sapna Desai and others who have done a mixed methods review in published in BMJ Global Health in 2020, I think, where they review the effect of women's group interventions on maternal and child health. And they have this, is it a club? Is it a classroom? Is it a collective? Like, you know, they kind of have these. And basically what they show is that women's groups can improve maternal and child health, but the issue of but they are helpful, much more effective if they are participatory and inclusive. That's where we lose much of it, right? So it's a very much a classroom knowledge transfer approach still, as opposed to building capabilities approach and problem solving and so on. So I do think inclusion of, paying attention to inclusion, especially of the most marginalized groups, as well as making them participatory and empowering, is clearly very important. In addition to that, that brings us, the policy part brings us to where we are unable to see a huge change in wasting or other things, anemia, is that health systems and as well as agriculture systems do need to actually strengthen the system wide, and not just supply side as we say, but the system wide architecture, governance, reach to these women and households in general. And that is very, very poor still in most countries, including in India. So that there is a gap, both implementation, policy, and how policy gets implemented as well. Thanks. Sorry.
Thank you, Sunitha. And we're just about at time, actually, so we won't get to everyone's questions. It's clearly an important, interesting, challenging topic. So we've not been able to cover everything today, but hopefully the conversation will continue offline and as well as in future webinars and work. Feel free to reach out to any of us with any further queries. But thank you again to all of our speakers today. Sunitha, I'll pass it to you for a very quick closing remark with our final minute here.
Yeah, or I can cede it to anyone who wants to answer the questions. Anything else? Yeah, okay. So yeah, thank you very much for this opportunity, and for this, especially to Lindsay and team, as well as to my co-authors and the audience here for their wonderful questions and attention. So I think as the next steps, as this question has been leading to, that some of this discussion is, the question in front of us is, how do we design programs with nutrition security in mind and also gender equity in mind? And that requires us, and one of these pathways we find is that crop diversity is an incredibly important mechanism. And all these interventions, as we were talking, need to be locally relevant to the context. And we all know that agriculture is hyper local and constraints are even more local at the household level. So I do think we need interventions that are participatory, as many of these interventions that have been that are included in this paper, and inclusive and including a capability enhancing focus remains important. The knee-jerk reaction is that these are not scalable, these are not cost efficient, but our work on Open shows that they are scalable as well as cost efficient as other models. And as I was just saying, the supply side, system side interventions are important, and also as one of the participants was saying, we really need to bridge the gap between these women's groups where we are discussing to the household and family in general as well, all in the context of obviously a cohesive and coherent policy approach between these sectors, like the food system, agriculture, as well as nutrition and health. Thanks from me.
Thank you so much, and thanks everyone so much for joining. We're at time, so I won't keep anyone, particularly those of you calling in from India, any later on this Friday night. But thanks again. The recording will be available, and again, feel free to reach out with any further queries. So thanks everyone.